I am your host. Let's begin our journey.
The invitation arrived on thick cream paper edged in gold, the sort of stationery that suggests wealth, tradition, and an unspoken expectation of obedience. Hercule Poirot studied it with narrowed eyes, holding it delicately between finger and thumb as though the card itself might reveal its secrets through touch alone. I watched him from across the small breakfast table in our London flat, already suspecting that whatever promised a quiet Christmas Eve among trusted friends would prove to be anything but. "It is always the quiet occasions that worry me most, Hastings," Poirot said at last. "When people insist too strongly upon peace, it is usually because peace is in very short supply." The host was Sir Reginald Carruthers, a shipping magnate whose name carried weight in both business and social circles. He had invited a carefully selected group to his country house, Hawthorne Grange, for Christmas Eve, family, associates, and a handful of guests whose presence felt deliberate rather than festive. Poirot, after a moment's thought, accepted at once. We arrived as dusk settled over the countryside, the bare trees etched black against a pale winter sky. Hawthorne Grange stood back from the road, solid and imposing, its windows glowing warmly as though eager to present a welcome. The house possessed that particular confidence of old money, nothing flashy, nothing accidental. Even the wreath on the door looked as though it had been approved by the committee. Inside, the atmosphere was carefully arranged. Fires burned in every hearth, garlands were placed with restraint, and soft music drifted faintly through the hall. Sir Reginald himself greeted us, broad-shouldered and stern-faced, his handshake firm to the point of challenge. His wife, Lady Carruthers, followed a moment later, elegant and composed, her smile quick and perfectly practiced. The other guests assembled in the drawing-room, and Poirot observed them with polite interest. Basil Carruthers, the son, lounged, with careless confidence, his charm worn like armour. Helena, his sister, sat very straight, her hands folded tightly, eyes flicking toward the door more often than necessary. Rupert Finch, Sir Reginald's business partner, spoke loudly and laughed too quickly. Mr. Vale, the family solicitor, said little, his sharp gaze missing nothing. Dr. Miriam Lyle, the household physician, stood apart, alert and thoughtful. Introductions were made, drinks served, and conversation began its slow, careful dance. Nothing overtly unpleasant occurred, yet beneath the polite exchanges ran an unmistakable tension, like a wire drawn too tight. Poirot noticed it at once. He always did. On a small table near the fireplace stood an object that did not belong among the tasteful decorations, an old brass handbell dulled with age, its leather handle worn smooth. Sir Reginald noticed Poirot's glance and dismissed it brusquely as an attic relic, nothing of importance. Yet Helena's eyes lingered on it with visible discomfort, and Basil's smile faltered for the briefest moment. Dinner followed, formal and lavish, marked by good wine and careful manners. Sir Reginald proposed a toast to Christmas and family, his voice steady though his expression betrayed strain. Poirot listened, saying little, his attention fixed not on the words but on the faces around the table. Afterward we returned to the drawing-room. The fire had burned low, shadows stretching long across the walls. Conversation resumed, lighter on the surface, heavier beneath. Poirot examined the bell more closely, lifting it, weighing it, then setting it down again without ringing it. Sir Reginald's irritation was immediate and poorly concealed. Shortly before midnight, the gathering broke up. Some spoke of attending church, others retired early. Sir Reginald announced he had business to attend to in his study. The house quieted, though the silence felt unnatural, strained. I was nearly asleep when the sound came, one sharp resonant ring, of a bell echoing faintly through the house. It was followed by silence so complete it seemed deliberate. Moments later, hurried footsteps passed my door. Then a knock, urgent, insistent. When I opened it, Dr. Lyle stood there, her face pale and drawn. "Captain Hastings," she said quietly, "you must come at once. It's Sir Reginald." Behind her, Poirot's door opened. He was fully dressed, calm and entirely unsurprised. "Yes," he said softly. "Now we begin." The study lay at the far end of the west wing, a room Sir Reginald used sparingly and always alone. Even before we reached it, I felt a curious oppression, as though the house itself had tightened around that particular space. The corridor lights were dimmed for the night, casting long shadows that clung to the walls. Several doors stood ajar, their occupants roused from bed, faces pale and uncertain as they gathered in uneasy silence. The study door was closed, solid oak, its brass handle gleaming dully. Dr. Lyle tested it once more, though she already knew the answer. "Locked," she said quietly, "from the inside." Lady Carruthers stood a little apart, one gloved hand pressed to her chest. Her breathing was controlled, but I noticed how carefully she avoided looking at the door itself. Basil hovered nearby, restless anger and fear warring in his expression. Mr. Vale had produced a handkerchief and was polishing his spectacles with unnecessary vigor, while Rupert Finch stared fixedly at the carpet as though it might provide instructions. Poirot stepped forward, examining the lock with almost affectionate attention. "No sign of force," he murmured. "And the key?" "There is no key in the corridor," Dr. Lyle replied. "I looked." "Of course," Poirot said gently. "Then the key must be inside." A footman was summoned and quickly returned with tools. Basil, impatient, shouldered past and drove his weight against the door. The wood cracked with a sharp report, and the lock splintered. The door swung inward. The smell struck me first, metallic, unmistakable. Sir Reginald lay near his desk, half on his side, one arm twisted awkwardly beneath him. His eyes were open, staring without comprehension. Blood had soaked into the rug beneath his chest, dark and spreading, and beside him lay the paper knife from his desk, its ivory handle smeared red. Lady Carruthers made a small sound and sank into the nearest chair. Basil swore under his breath. Rupert Finch turned away abruptly. Dr. Lyle knelt at once, efficient despite the shock. She checked for a pulse, listened, then rose slowly. "He has been dead for several minutes," she said. "There is nothing to be done." Poirot had not approached the body. Instead, he stood near the threshold, surveying the room as a whole. His gaze moved from the overturned chair to the desk lamp still burning, then to the telephone, its receiver hanging loose. "He was making a call," I said. "Or receiving one," Poirot replied softly, "or wishing it to appear so." He crossed to the desk, careful not to disturb anything. The papers were arranged with unnatural neatness, squared and aligned. Poirot frowned slightly. "A man attacked suddenly does not tidy before he dies," he said. His attention shifted to the small brass bell on the desk, the same bell we had seen earlier by the fire. It stood upright, perfectly placed. "It rang once," Poirot said. "Only once." Helena, pale as frost, spoke for the first time. "I heard it. It sounded deliberate." Poirot inclined his head. "Just so, mademoiselle. A single ring is not a cry for help. It is a signal." "A signal to whom?" Basil demanded. "That," Poirot said mildly, "is the question." He glanced at the door again, at the shattered lock, then at the room beyond. "This was a locked room," he continued, "yet someone wished us to believe they were alive long enough to summon attention. Order and disorder have been carefully balanced here." Lady Carruthers lifted her head, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Are you suggesting this was staged?" Poirot met her gaze calmly. "I am suggesting nothing yet, madame. I am observing." Footsteps echoed in the corridor as servants gathered, whispering. Poirot turned to them gently but firmly. "No one leaves the house," he said. "No one enters this room again without my consent. Tonight we are all guests and suspects." A hush fell over the study, broken only by the soft ticking of the mantel clock. Poirot looked once more at Sir Reginald's still form, then closed his eyes briefly, as if arranging pieces in his mind. "The bell rang," he said quietly, but the truth did not answer it. The remainder of the night passed in a strange, suspended fashion, as though time itself were reluctant to move forward. Sir Reginald's body was left undisturbed in the study, the door guarded by a solemn footman, who looked as though he would rather be anywhere else in the world. The guests dispersed at Poirot's polite but unmistakable insistence, each retreating to their rooms under the uneasy knowledge that sleep would be hard to come by, and that morning would bring questions no one wished to answer. I found Poirot in the small sitting room adjoining our bedrooms, seated upright in an armchair, his hands folded neatly over his stomach, his eyes half closed. He looked absurdly as though he were preparing for a concert rather than contemplating murder. "You are not tired?" I asked. "Tired, yes," he replied softly, "but sleep would be discourteous to the facts. They deserve my full attention." He opened his eyes and fixed me with a penetrating look. "Tell me, Hastings, what strikes you most strongly about what we have seen?" I considered it. The locked door, of course. And the bell. It all feels theatrical. Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, you feel it too. The sense of performance. Murderers often believe themselves artists." At first light the house stirred again. Breakfast was served in subdued silence, the long table feeling suddenly far too large for its occupants. Faces were drawn, eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. Lady Carruthers did not appear, sending word through a maid that she was unwell. Basil arrived late, his usual confidence replaced by a brittle irritability. Helena barely touched her tea. Finch read the newspaper without turning a page. Mr. Vale observed everyone over the rim of his cup with legal caution. Poirot watched them all, noting who avoided whose gaze, who spoke too quickly, who said nothing at all. One by one, he asked them to remain behind after breakfast. The first was Basil. They spoke in the study's anteroom, Poirot seated, Basil pacing. Basil insisted his father had enemies, business rivals, disgruntled former employees. He spoke of arguments, of a strained household, of impatience that had curdled into resentment. Yet when Poirot asked where he had been at the moment the bell rang, Basil hesitated just long enough to be noticed. "I was in my room," he said, "alone." Poirot nodded, as if this were quite expected. Helena was next. She answered questions carefully, too carefully perhaps, her words measured, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She admitted she had feared her father, not because he was cruel, but because he was controlling. When Poirot asked about the bell, she looked down. "I thought it meant that something was ending," she said quietly. Dr. Lyle proved brisk and professional. She spoke of Sir Reginald's health, his heart, his temper. She explained the wound with clinical precision, but paused when Poirot asked whether the death could have been instantaneous. "Almost," she said, "but not entirely." That pause did not escape him. Rupert Finch grew defensive under questioning. He spoke of business disagreements, of financial pressure, of Sir Reginald's stubborn refusal to listen. Yet he insisted that murder would have been foolish, disastrous. Poirot agreed pleasantly. "Foolish, yes," he said, "but desperation has a way of dulling wisdom." Mr. Vale was last. The solicitor's answers were precise, factual, and emotionally empty. He confirmed the existence of recent changes to Sir Reginald's will, then stopped abruptly, as though realizing he had said too much. Poirot thanked him kindly. When the interviews were over, Poirot returned to the study alone. I watched him from the doorway as he examined the room once more, this time with deeper intent. He measured distances with his eyes, traced imaginary movements through the air, studied the bell, the desk, the door. "The locked room," he murmured. "It is meant to impress, to simplify, but simplicity is often a disguise." He turned to me suddenly. "Hastings, a bell that rings once is not an alarm, it is an announcement. Someone wished us to come, but only after everything was already finished." "You think the bell was rung by the killer?" I asked. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "I think it was rung by someone who wished to control when the body was found. That tells us much about their mind." Outside, the winter sun crept higher, pale and cold, illuminating the frost on the lawns. Inside Hawthorne Grange, the atmosphere thickened with unspoken accusation. Poirot straightened his cuffs with meticulous care. "Now," he said quietly, "the game begins in earnest, and already someone is afraid." By mid-morning the house had settled into a strained routine, the kind that follows a tragedy when people cling to normal habits in the hope that they might steady their nerves. Footsteps echoed too loudly in the corridors, doors were closed with exaggerated care, and every casual glance carried an unspoken question. Poirot, however, appeared entirely at ease, as though the tension nourished rather than disturbed him. He requested that the study be left undisturbed and asked the staff to carry on with their duties as usual. Routine, he explained to me, is most instructive. When people pretend nothing has changed, they reveal exactly what has. We began with the servants. Mrs. Alder, the housekeeper, was flustered and indignant at the suggestion that anyone under her supervision might be involved. She spoke at length about Sir Reginald's habits, his fondness for order, his insistence that doors be locked at night. Poirot listened politely, then asked a single question. "Madame, when Sir Reginald worked late, did he ring for tea or for company?" "For tea, sir, always tea." Poirot thanked her and made a small note. The footman on duty that evening confirmed hearing the bell and nothing else. No raised voices, no struggle, no cry for help. Poirot nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That is most interesting," he murmured once we were alone again. "A man stabbed in his own study, yet no sound of alarm. Either he was taken entirely by surprise, or he trusted the person who stood before him." We returned to the study together. Poirot stood very still, as if listening to the room itself. He moved to the desk, running his fingers lightly along its edge, then stopped. "Observe, Hastings, the chair. It was positioned neatly, pushed in as though Sir Reginald had risen calmly rather than in alarm." Poirot crouched slightly, peering at the rug beneath. "No signs of sudden movement," he said, "no scuffle. This was not a confrontation that escalated. It was a moment that ended." He examined the locked door once more, testing the mechanism with delicate care. "A simple lock," he continued, "easily secured from inside, but easier still for someone who already possessed the key." I frowned. "You think the door was locked deliberately to create the illusion of impossibility?" "Mais oui, the locked room is a magician's trick. One shows you the empty hat, but the rabbit has already been placed elsewhere." At luncheon, Poirot deliberately altered the seating, placing certain guests closer together and others apart. He spoke lightly, even charmingly, yet his eyes missed nothing. When Helena spoke of her father, Basil interrupted. When Basil defended himself, Finch grew tense. Dr. Lyle watched them all with professional detachment that did not quite conceal her unease. Poirot turned the conversation gently toward Christmas plans, toward wills, toward expectations. At the mention of inheritance, Lady Carruthers, who had finally joined them, stiffened, her hand tightening around her napkin. "A sad time for such discussions," she said sharply. "On the contrary," Poirot replied smoothly, "it is precisely at sad times that the truth slips out." After the meal, Poirot asked Basil to walk with him in the garden. I followed at a discreet distance. Basil's irritation soon surfaced. "You think it was me," he said abruptly. "Everyone does." Poirot stopped beside a frost-dusted hedge. "No, monsieur. I think you are angry." "That is not the same thing." "You don't know my father," Basil snapped. "He controlled everything. Even his death, it seems." Poirot regarded him kindly. "Yes. That, I believe, is very close to the heart of this matter." Later, Poirot spoke privately with Dr. Lyle. When she emerged, her face was pale, her composure shaken. She avoided everyone's eyes and retired to her room at once. As evening approached, Poirot gathered me in the sitting room. "We have reached a most delicate stage," he said quietly. "Someone believes themselves safe. They think the locked door has defeated reason. Tonight, Hastings, I shall disturb that confidence." "How?" I asked. Poirot smiled, smoothing his moustache with satisfaction. "By making the guilty party think I am wrong. When a murderer relaxes, mon ami, the mind betrays itself. Outside, the first snowflakes of Christmas Eve began to fall, soft and silent, settling over Hawthorne Grange like a deceptive peace. Inside, Poirot's little grey cells were already preparing the next move. That evening, Poirot appeared to abandon the investigation entirely. He dressed with particular care, selecting a tie of impeccable symmetry, and joined the others in the drawing-room as though nothing more serious than an awkward family gathering weighed upon the house. To an untrained observer, he might have seemed distracted, even faintly bored. I knew better. This was the mask he wore when his thoughts were racing ahead of everyone else's. The drawing-room fire crackled cheerfully, throwing warm light across strained faces. Poirot settled into an armchair, accepted a cup of tisane, and began speaking of entirely inconsequential matters: the weather, the difficulty of travel at Christmas, the curious English fondness for draughty old houses. Gradually, my shoulders relaxed, voices softened. The tension eased, just as Poirot intended. "It is most unfortunate," he said lightly, "that this affair should occur at such a time. Christmas Eve should be for peace, not police inquiries. Still, I suppose one must accept that some mysteries remain unresolved." I caught the faintest flicker of surprise passing across more than one face. Basil frowned. "You mean you haven't—" Poirot raised a hand gently. "I mean only that I am not yet satisfied. There are contradictions, yes, but contradictions are common. People forget, they confuse times, they misremember." Dr. Lyle shifted in her seat. "But surely the locked door is very impressive," Poirot agreed, "almost too impressive. It encourages us to stop thinking." Lady Carruthers gave a short, brittle laugh. "You saying we imagined the lock?" "None," Poirot replied pleasantly. "Only that we may have imagined its importance." He allowed that to settle, then turned the conversation elsewhere, asking Finch about London, Helena about her music, Basil about his plans after Christmas. Yet beneath the politeness ran a subtle current. Poirot asked questions that appeared harmless but were carefully chosen, each one testing a reaction, measuring a hesitation, weighing a glance. When Helena mentioned she had gone to the study earlier that evening to collect a book her father had borrowed, Poirot inclined his head. "And at what hour was this?" "Just before dinner." "Around 6:30. And the study door?" "It was unlocked." Poirot nodded as though this detail meant nothing at all. Later, as the fire burned low, Poirot deliberately made a mistake. He remarked that Sir Reginald had likely been killed instantly, leaving no time for thought or reaction. The words hung in the air. "No," Dr. Lyle said sharply, then stopped herself. Poirot's eyes lifted at once. "No?" She flushed. "I mean, perhaps not instantly. It's difficult to be certain." "Ah," Poirot said gently. "But you seemed quite certain this morning." Silence followed. Dr. Lyle stared at the fire, her jaw tight. Soon after, Poirot excused himself early, claiming fatigue. I followed him back to our rooms. "You were wrong on purpose," I said. "Mais oui," he replied calmly. "One must sometimes be wrong to see who rushes to correct you. Truth has a way of provoking impatience." He paced the room slowly, hands clasped behind his back. "There is a moment, Hastings, between certainty and fear. The guilty person lives there now. They believe the locked door protects them, yet they feel the ground shifting beneath their feet." "What will they do?" I asked. "Perhaps nothing," Poirot said. "Perhaps something foolish. Either way, they will reveal themselves." As the house settled for the night, a strange stillness descended, deeper than before. Snow lay thick against the windows, muffling sound, isolating Hawthorne Grange from the world beyond. Somewhere down the corridor, a door closed softly. A footstep paused, then moved on. Poirot stood by the window, gazing out at the snow-covered grounds. "Christmas Eve," he murmured. "A time for secrets, for conscience, for ghosts of the past. If there is to be another move in this game, mon ami, it will come before morning." I slept badly, aware of the house breathing around us, every creak and whisper magnified by expectation. And though nothing outward occurred that night, I sensed that somewhere within Hawthorne Grange, a decision had been made, one that Poirot was already prepared to meet. I was awakened shortly after dawn by a sharp knock at our door, followed almost immediately by Poirot's voice, calm yet unmistakably alert. I opened it to find him already fully dressed, his shoes polished, his moustache immaculate, as though the day had been waiting for him rather than the other way around. "It has happened, Hastings," he said quietly, "exactly as I expected." In the corridor stood Mrs. Alder, the housekeeper, pale and shaking. "It's Dr. Lyle," she whispered. "She fainted in the dispensary. Said she couldn't breathe. Keeps saying she'd ruined everything." Poirot thanked her and proceeded at once, his pace unhurried but purposeful. We found Dr. Lyle seated on a narrow couch, a glass of water trembling in her hand. She looked exhausted, undone by a night without rest. "I did not kill him," she said at once before Poirot had spoken. "I swear it." Poirot inclined his head politely. "I did not accuse you, madame. But your mind accuses you very loudly." She stared at him, eyes wide. "You don't understand. I only tried to help." "That," Poirot replied gently, "is often the beginning of tragedy." He asked her a series of seemingly innocent questions: how long she had known Sir Reginald, whether she had ever been alone with him in the study, whether she had been aware of changes to his will. Her answers came quickly at first, then faltered when he asked about the exact timing of her movements on Christmas Eve. "You are a doctor," Poirot continued softly. "You know precisely how long consciousness can persist after a wound such as the one Sir Reginald suffered. You corrected me last night because you could not help yourself." Her face crumpled. "He wasn't dead at once," she whispered. "He spoke." Poirot said nothing. "He said Basil's name," she went on, tears spilling freely now. "He said he had made a mistake, that he meant to change things in the morning." Poirot thanked her and left her. In the care of Mrs. Alder, his grave. In the corridor, he turned to me. "Now we see the shape of it. The crime was not only murder, it was interrupted." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Someone feared the morning," Poirot replied, "feared what Sir Reginald intended to do when daylight came. We sought Basil next. He was found in the billiard room, staring down at the table as though trying to calculate an impossible shot. When Poirot entered, Basil straightened, bracing himself. "You are wondering," Poirot said, "why your name was spoken." Basil stiffened. "What are you talking about?" "Your father," Poirot continued, "was not killed instantly. He had time to think, to regret, to name what weighed most heavily upon him." Basil's composure cracked. "He told me he was cutting me out," he burst out. Then the next day he said he'd reconsidered. "He was playing with me, always playing." "And yet," Poirot said quietly, "you were not the one who entered that study with a weapon." Basil stared at him. "Then who was?" Poirot did not answer. Instead, he excused himself and asked that everyone remain in the house until further notice. By midday, Inspector Shaw arrived, summoned discreetly by Poirot earlier that morning. Poirot spoke with him privately, laying out certain facts but withholding others. The inspector listened, his skepticism gradually giving way to interest. "There is one more thing," Poirot concluded, "one final act of pressure." He requested that a note be delivered to Lady Carruthers, asking her to join him alone in the study at 3 o'clock. I was present, seated quietly in the corner. Lady Carruthers entered composed, elegant, her grief worn like a carefully chosen garment. "You wished to see me, Monsieur Poirot?" "Yes, madame," he said. "Because you are the only person in this house who has not yet lost control." She smiled thinly. "Is that meant as a compliment?" "It is an observation," Poirot replied. "You loved Sir Reginald once. Then you learned to endure him, but you did not need him." Her eyes hardened. "Get to the point." Poirot leaned forward slightly. The bell was rung deliberately after the act to summon witnesses. The door was locked to create mystery. But the killer misjudged one thing. "And what was that?" she asked coolly. "Guilt," Poirot said. "Guilt cannot be locked out. It leaks. And this morning, madame, it began to leak from someone very close to you." For the first time, Lady Carruthers looked afraid. Outside, church bells began to ring for Christmas morning. Inside Hawthorne Grange, Poirot had set the final pieces in motion, and the truth, long restrained, was preparing to break free. The afternoon wore on with a peculiar heaviness, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Inspector Shaw remained discreetly in the background, allowing Poirot to continue his quiet orchestration. Word spread, carefully, intentionally, that Poirot had reached a conclusion but wished to confirm one final detail. The effect was immediate. People grew restless, voices lowered. Footsteps paused outside doors that had no reason to be paused outside at all. Poirot asked that tea be served at 4. Everyone attended. Even Lady Carruthers, pale but composed, took her place at the table. Snow had ceased, leaving the grounds stark and brilliant beneath a weak winter sun. Poirot sat at the head, hands folded, his gaze moving from face to face with benign attentiveness. "It is curious," he said lightly, "how often we believe the most dangerous moment has passed, when in fact it is just arriving." No one replied. He sipped his tea, then turned to Helena. "Mademoiselle, you told me you went to study before dinner to collect a book. Yes, she said, wary. And the bell? Did you hear it ring from your room? Yes, once only. She hesitated. I thought so. Poirot nodded. And yet Mrs. Alder believed she heard it twice. A small confusion, perhaps. Basil pushed back his chair. What is this? Are we going to sit here while you toy with us? Poirot's smile did not fade. I do not toy, monsieur. I observe. At that moment a sharp sound echoed from the corridor. A crash, followed by a cry. Mrs. Alder burst in, breathless. It's Mr. Finch, she gasped. In the west passage. He's fallen. We hurried out. Finch lay slumped at the foot of the narrow staircase that led to the old gallery, his leg twisted unnaturally, his face ashen with shock. A candlestick lay nearby, fallen from his hand. Inspector Shaw took charge at once, summoning help. Finch was carried to a sofa, where Dr. Lyle examined him with brisk efficiency. He'll live, she said shortly. But that was no accident. He slipped because he was running. Poirot knelt to examine the stairs. Running? He repeated softly. Yes, running away from something, or toward it. Finch, sweating and pale, glared up at Poirot. This is madness, he said hoarsely. I've done nothing. Not murder, Poirot agreed, but perhaps concealment. Finch's eyes flicked involuntarily toward the gallery door above. Poirot followed the glance. Inspector, Poirot said quietly, would you be so kind as to look in the gallery cupboard? Shaw did so. Inside, concealed behind old canvases and dust sheets, lay a small leather case. Within it were documents, amended, drafts of Sir Reginald's will, unsigned but unmistakable. Finch closed his eyes. He asked me to prepare them, he muttered, then changed his mind. Again. He enjoyed it. Poirot straightened. And you feared the morning, monsieur. You feared what he might finally decide. I didn't kill him, Finch insisted. No, Poirot said gently. But you hoped the night would solve your problem for you. The interruption had done its work. Nerves were frayed. Control was slipping. As dusk approached, Poirot asked that everyone assemble in the study after dinner. The room felt smaller than before, crowded with anticipation. Poirot stood by the desk, his presence calm and commanding. One more thing, he said softly. Last night, someone attempted to remove an object from this room after the bell had rung. Lady Carruthers's breath caught. The bell, Poirot continued, was rung not to summon help, but to fix a time, to create an ending. But there was something here that did not belong to the performance. He reached into his pocket and placed a small object on the desk, a slender brass key. This, he said, opens the inner drawer of the desk, the drawer that contained Sir Reginald's private correspondence. Lady Carruthers stared at it. That key was lost years ago. No, Poirot replied. It was borrowed. And last night it was returned, too late. Silence fell like a weight. Poirot looked around the room, his eyes resting briefly on each person, lingering last on Lady Carruthers. The truth, he said quietly, is ready. And it will not wait much longer. Outside, darkness settled once more over Hawthorne Grange. Inside, the final reckoning drew near, and no locked door, no careful composure could keep it at bay. Night fell early, the winter darkness pressing close to the windows as though the house were being slowly sealed away from the world. Lamps were lit, their warm glow failing to dispel the sense that something unfinished lingered in every corner of Hawthorne Grange. Poirot moved among the guests with quiet courtesy, yet I could see that his mind was fixed elsewhere, turning over a single stubborn thought. It was just after 9 when the cry rang out. It came from the upper floor, sharp and panicked, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door slamming. Poirot was on his feet at once. "Inspector," he said calmly, "I think our Christmas has produced one more surprise." We hurried upstairs to find Helena standing in the corridor outside her room, white-faced and shaking, her hand pressed to her mouth. "It's my mother," she whispered. "She's locked herself inside Father's dressing room. She said she couldn't bear it anymore." Poirot's expression tightened, though his voice remained gentle. "Did she say anything else, mademoiselle?" Helena nodded, tears welling. "She said it was all ending tonight." Inspector Shaw ordered the door forced at once. When it gave way, the scene inside stopped us short. Lady Carruthers lay slumped in a chair beside the window, a small glass fallen from her hand and shattered on the floor. A faint, bitter smell hung in the air. Dr. Lyle rushed forward, checking her pulse, her face grave. "She's alive," she said, "but only just. Laudanum, a significant dose." Poirot knelt, retrieving the glass with a handkerchief. "A confession in liquid form," he murmured. "How very English." As Lady Carruthers was carried to her bed, Poirot's gaze moved to the dressing table. A drawer stood open. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied neatly with ribbon. "These," Poirot said softly, "are what she could not live with." Inspector Shaw examined them, his brow furrowing. "Correspondence between Sir Reginald and Mr. Finch, and others," Poirot nodded. "And the motive at last becomes clear. Not money alone, not anger, but exposure. Downstairs the house seemed to exhale as the news spread. Lady Carruthers had survived, for now, but her attempt spoke louder than words. Poirot requested that everyone remain awake and present. There would be no more retreats to bedrooms, no more waiting for morning. He sat with me in the drawing-room, while Inspector Shaw reviewed the letters. "She did not kill him," I said quietly. "No," Poirot agreed, "but she feared the truth he intended to reveal. And fear can drive people to strange alliances." "What alliances?" Poirot's eyes flicked toward the closed door through which Basil had just passed, the kind born not of loyalty, but of desperation. At 10, Poirot asked that Basil join us. Basil arrived pale, his bravado gone entirely. "You knew about the letters," Poirot said calmly. Basil's jaw tightened. I knew he was planning something. He said he was tired of lies. "And you?" Poirot pressed. "What were you tired of, monsieur?" Basil looked away. Being controlled, being threatened with nothing. Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Your father intended to expose financial irregularities involving Mr. Finch and to revise his will in the morning. He told Dr. Lyle he had made a mistake. He told you he was reconsidering, but someone else knew that morning must never come." Basil's hands trembled. "I didn't kill him." "I believe you," Poirot said quietly. "But you helped after." The silence stretched. "You rang the bell," Poirot continued. "Not to summon help, but to create witnesses to fix the time of death, and you locked the door because you thought impossibility would protect you." Basil's shoulders sagged. "I only meant to protect my mother." Poirot shook his head gently. "No, you meant to protect the illusion." Inspector Shaw stepped forward. "Then who struck the blow?" Poirot straightened. "That," he said softly, "we shall answer together. But now we know this, the murder was not born in anger that night. It was planned in daylight, sharpened by fear, and completed by silence." Outside, the wind rose again, rattling the windows like an impatient hand. Inside Hawthorne Grange, the truth had shifted shape once more, and Poirot's little grey cells had found the final path forward. The night deepened, and with it came a strange clarity, as though the house itself had finally grown tired of secrets. Poirot requested that no one be allowed to leave the ground floor. Inspector Shaw agreed, posting an officer discreetly at the foot of the stairs. The fire burned low in the drawing-room, its embers pulsing softly, and the ticking of the clock grew unnervingly loud. Poirot stood apart, his head slightly inclined, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He seemed to be listening, not to the people in the room, but to something much quieter. I had learned by then that this was when his thoughts were at their most dangerous. "Hastings," he said suddenly, "do you recall what Sir Reginald was doing when the bell rang?" "He said he was going to his study," I replied, "to attend to business." "Just so," Poirot murmured. "Business, always business. And yet the papers on his desk were arranged with such care, such finality. That was not the desk of a man in the middle of work. It was the desk of a man who believed he was about to conclude something." Inspector Shaw approached. "I've reviewed the letters. Sir Reginald planned to confront Finch in the morning. He intended to involve the authorities." Poirot nodded. "Which means someone else knew. Someone who had access not only to the study, but to Sir Reginald's confidence." His gaze drifted briefly to Dr. Lyle, who sat rigidly on the edge of her chair. She met his eyes, then looked away. Poirot crossed the room and addressed her gently. "Madame, you told us Sir Reginald spoke after he was wounded. You told us he was named Basil, but you did not tell us everything." Dr. Lyle's breath caught. "I told you what mattered. You told me what mattered to you, Poirot replied softly, but not what mattered to him. She hesitated, then shook her head. He said too late. A hush fell. Too late, Poirot repeated, not a name, a realization. He returned to the study once more, inviting Inspector Shaw and me to follow. The room felt different now, less theatrical, more human. Poirot examined the floor carefully, then knelt beside the rug. Observe, he said, here, where the blood spread, and here, this faint mark. I crouched beside him. A smear, a footprint partially cleaned. Someone attempted to restore order after the disorder. He rose and examined the desk lamp, and this lamp. It was turned off after the death, not immediately. Later. Inspector Shaw frowned. Why would that matter? Because it tells us the killers stayed, Poirot replied. Not in panic, not in flight. They stayed to think. Poirot moved to the window and opened it. Slightly. Cold air rushed in. He inhaled once, sharply. Snow, I said. And ink. Poirot smiled. You are learning, Hastings. Ink, fresh when the window was opened. Someone wrote something, then thought better of it. He returned to the desk and opened the inner drawer with the brass key. Inside lay a single sheet of paper, torn neatly in half. Inspector Shaw picked it up. A confession. No, Poirot said. A decision. Sir Reginald began to write. Then he stopped. Because someone arrived. And that someone, Shaw said slowly, was expected. Exactly, Poirot replied. The killer was not an intruder. They were invited. He straightened, his face composed, almost serene. Now we have our hidden clue, Hastings. Not a weapon, not a lock, but timing. He glanced at the clock on the mantel. The bell rang the moment the body was discovered. The snow fixed the moment the window was opened. The lamp fixed the moment the killer left. And all three, I said quietly, contradict each other. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Contradictions are the footprints of truth. He closed the window, replaced the paper carefully, and locked the drawer once more. We are ready, he said softly. Tomorrow morning, before the authorities arrive in force, I shall ask everyone to join me here. Inspector Shaw nodded. You're certain? Poirot adjusted his cuffs with meticulous care. Mon ami, certainty is not belief, it is alignment. And now all the little grey cells are in agreement. As we left the study, the clock struck midnight. Christmas morning had arrived, and with it, the moment when deception would finally give way to order. Morning light crept reluctantly into Hawthorne Grange, pale and cold, revealing a house stripped of its nighttime illusions. Poirot insisted that everyone gather in the study once more. No one protested. The night had taken something from them all, and they sensed that the end, whatever shape it took, could no longer be delayed. Inspector Shaw stood near the door, notebook ready. Helena sat rigid beside the fireplace, her eyes fixed on the floor. Basil leaned against the wall, arms crossed defensively. Dr. Lyle hovered near the desk, her face drawn, while Mr. Finch stood apart, his habitual smoothness finally worn thin. The air felt tight, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Poirot waited until the clock struck 9. Then he spoke. Mes amis, we have circled one another long enough. Sir Reginald Carruthers did not die because of rage, nor accident, nor a sudden quarrel. He died because he decided to speak the truth, and someone could not allow that truth to live. He moved slowly toward the desk. Sir Reginald summoned one person that evening, not his wife, not his son, but a man whose future depended entirely upon his silence. Mr. Finch stiffened. This is absurd. Poirot inclined his head politely. Is it? You handled Sir Reginald's finances. You knew precisely how much he had concealed and how much you had taken. The letters, lady. Carruthers feared were not merely embarrassing, they were devastating. Inspector Shaw glanced up sharply. You're saying Finch killed him? Poirot raised a finger. Patience. We deal in precision, not haste. He turned to Dr. Lyle. Madame, you were present when Sir Reginald was wounded. You heard his final realization. Too late, no regret, recognition. Dr. Lyle swallowed. He realized Finch would never agree to a peaceful settlement. Poirot nodded. Exactly. Sir Reginald confronted Mr. Finch privately in this room. He offered him a choice, confession, restitution, or exposure, and Mr. Finch, who has lived his life by calculation, chose the only option he believed remained. Finch's voice broke through. You have no proof. Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, but proof is such a clumsy word. Let us speak of behavior." He gestured to the desk lamp. "You turned it off after the act. You stayed long enough to think. Long enough to place the weapon, arrange the room, and wait." Poirot turned to Basil. "And you, monsieur, entered later. You found your father. You rang the bell not to save him, but to protect your mother. You locked the door because impossibility felt safer than truth." Basil's face crumpled. "I thought if it looked impossible, it would become impossible," Poirot finished gently. "But truth does not care for appearances." Poirot faced Lady Carruthers, who sat very still now. "Madame, you feared exposure. You attempted to escape through oblivion, but you did not kill your husband." Her eyes filled with tears. "I wanted it to stop. All of it." Poirot inclined his head. "And it will." He turned back to Finch. "The ink on Sir Reginald's unfinished letter was still wet when the window was opened. You opened it to disguise the time. But snow betrays all things, monsieur. It does not forget." Inspector Shaw stepped forward. "Mr. Finch, you are under arrest." Finch laughed once, hollow and sharp. "You can't prove intent." Poirot met his gaze calmly. "Intent is written in fear, and fear leaves marks no one can erase." As Finch was led away, silence settled over the room, heavy but cleansed. Poirot adjusted his cuffs and glanced at the mantel clock. "Order," he said softly, "is restored not by punishment alone, but by understanding." Helena looked up, her voice barely audible. "Will we ever forget this Christmas?" Poirot regarded her kindly. "Non, mademoiselle. But memory is not a prison, it is a teacher." Later, as we prepared to leave, Poirot paused at the doorway and looked back once more at the study. "Human nature," he murmured, "is like Christmas itself, full of promises, shadows, and surprises. One must choose which to believe." Then he took his hat, straightened his coat, and walked into the pale winter morning, the case complete at last. The house began to empty with surprising speed, as though everyone were eager to outrun the memories that clung to Hawthorne Grange. Inspector Shaw and his men departed with their prisoner before noon, their footsteps echoing briefly in the hall before fading into silence. The study, once the stage for accusation and revelation, returned to its quiet dignity, though the air still felt altered, like a room after a storm had passed. Poirot stood by the window, watching the police car disappear down the long drive. His posture was immaculate as ever, yet there was a gravity about him that I recognized well. He did not take pleasure in triumph, only satisfaction in balance restored. "It is always the same, Hastings," he said softly. "People believe that truth is cruel. In reality, it is the lies that do the deepest harm." Basil remained behind, standing uncertainly near the fireplace. He looked older than he had the night before, the sharp edges of resentment dulled by exhaustion and remorse. "I didn't mean to make things worse," he said. "I thought I was protecting what little family I had left." Poirot turned to him with gentle firmness. "Protection that is built upon deception is like a house built upon sand. It collapses eventually, and often upon those it is meant to shelter." Basil nodded slowly, absorbing the words, then left without another sound. Helena lingered longest. She approached Poirot hesitantly, her hands clasped together as though she feared they might tremble if released. "You saw everything," she said, "before any of us did." Poirot smiled faintly. "I saw only what was shown, mademoiselle. It is the heart that reveals itself always, even when the lips do not." She thanked him quietly and followed the others out into the cold morning. At last, Poirot and I were alone. The fire had burned down to embers, and the clock resumed its gentle ticking, no longer accusatory, merely marking time as it always had. "You will write this one up, I suppose?" Poirot remarked lightly. "I will," I said, "though I doubt I shall do justice to the way you untangled it all." Poirot waved a hand dismissively. "Bah! It is not a matter of brilliance, only by listening. Sir Reginald believed power would protect him. Finch believed cleverness would save him. Basil believed illusion could shield love. All were mistaken. We took our coats and prepared to leave. As we stepped outside, snow began to fall once more, light and steady, covering the gravel drive in a clean white layer. "How fitting," I said, "as though the world itself wishes to start again." Poirot nodded. "Snow is honest, Hastings. It shows every footprint, and then, in time, it erases them. At the gate, Poirot paused and looked back at the house one final time. "Christmas," he said thoughtfully, "is a season of reflection. For some, it brings peace. For others, it brings the courage to act. And for a very few, it brings the reckoning they have long delayed." We turned away together, leaving Hawthorne Grange behind. The road ahead was quiet, the snow softening every sound. Whatever shadows remained inside that house would fade with time, but the lesson would endure. As for Poirot, he walked beside me with his usual measured stride, immaculate even in the cold, his little grey cells already, no doubt, preparing for the next puzzle human nature would place in his path. The train pulled away from the small country station with a sigh of steam, carrying us back toward London and the ordinary rhythms of life. Snow lay thick across the fields, smoothing the landscape into something almost innocent, as if nothing dark had ever taken place there. Poirot sat opposite me, his coat immaculate despite the journey, his hat placed precisely on the rack above. He gazed out of the window, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. For some time, neither of us spoke. I sensed that the case, though concluded, still lingered in his mind, not as a puzzle solved, but as a human drama whose echoes would remain. "At Christmas," Poirot said at last without turning his head, "people expect miracles. They forget that the greatest miracle is honesty." "You think things might have ended differently?" I asked. Poirot inclined his head slightly. "Always. That is the tragedy. Each of them had a moment when a different choice was possible. Sir Reginald could have confessed sooner. Finch could have accepted justice. Basil could have trusted the truth. Even Lady Carruthers, had she spoken instead of swallowing her despair, his voice softened. But human beings, mon ami, prefer the comfort of silence until silence becomes unbearable. The train swayed gently, the steady rhythm of the wheels oddly soothing. I watched Poirot adjust his cuffs, restoring perfect symmetry after the slightest disturbance, and was struck by how this small ritual seemed to anchor him. "And you?" I asked. "Does it never weigh on you?" "Seeing the same patterns repeat," Poirot smiled faintly. "Of course it weighs. I am not a machine, Hastings, but I remind myself of this. When the truth is spoken, even painfully, it frees more people than it wounds. That is why I persist." At the next station, a group of carolers stood on the platform, their voices thin but cheerful in the cold air. Poirot listened, his eyes brightening just a touch. "Ah," he said, "you see, even after sorrow people sing." When we reached London, the city greeted us with damp streets and festive lights strung bravely against the grey sky. Life had not paused for murder or mourning. It pressed on, impatient and alive. As we stepped down from the train, Poirot paused, surveying the crowd with his familiar air of mild curiosity. Clerks hurried past, lovers laughed, children tugged at mittened hands. None of them knew of Hawthorne Grange, or the quiet catastrophe that had unfolded there. "And that," Poirot said softly, "is as it should be. Mysteries are not meant to linger. They are meant to be understood, then released." We walked together toward the street, where a cab waited. Poirot stopped once more and turned to me. "You will write it, yes?" he said. "But remember, Hastings, do not write only of the crime. Write of the choices, of the moments when people might have been better, kinder, braver." "I will," I promised. He smiled, satisfied, and stepped into the cab. As it pulled away, Poirot lifted a gloved hand in farewell, his figure soon swallowed by the city's movement and noise. I stood for a moment longer, watching the snow begin to fall again, softening London's hard edges, just as it had softened the grounds of Hawthorne Grange. Somewhere behind those walls, a family would try to heal, and somewhere ahead, another secret would already be forming. Such is the world Poirot moves through, I reflected. A world where order and chaos walk side by side, and where a small, precise man with an extraordinary understanding of the human heart stands ready to intervene. And as I turned homeward, I could not help but think that, for all its sorrow, the affair of that Christmas Eve had left behind something quietly valuable, the reminder that truth, once uncovered, allows life to begin again.